Joining me on the podcast today is Sterrin Smallbridge. Sterrin is a Dutch ecologist and herpetologist, and you may be familiar with her Instagram page at Sterrin's Wild World. Sterrin is incredibly passionate about wildlife conservation, and she is amazingly adventurous. Some of the stories she tells you in the show are really amazing, and she is a perfect example of the legacy that's been left on the earth from Steve Irwin. Now, obviously, Steve Irwin is a huge inspiration for many animal lovers, and this story that Sterrin tells is a perfect example of that. She has, come full circle from being the small child watching him on TV to being out in the world and perpetuating the same message that Steve lived for on a daily basis. And I really don't see Sterrin as the next Steve Irwin or something like that. I do really see her as her own person paving her own trail, and she's up to her own things, but she used Steve Irwin as sort of a foundation of inspiration to go out into the world and make a difference in the same way that Steve would. So really, really interesting story. You can hear the passion in Sterrin's voice, and I'm not going to say much more. Let's just get right to the show. Hi, I'm Dillon, and you're listening to the Animals at Home podcast. All right, Sterrin, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, you, judging by your Instagram page, seem to be extremely adventurous. You're always up to something. And so I'm glad to have you at, that brief moment that you're at home. We can actually have this conversation. Have you always been as adventurous as you are?
Yes, actually, for as long as I can remember, I've always been adventurous. I would always run away from home. My mom called the police a couple of times because she thought I was gone, and I usually was gone. So, I've always been adventurous.
Where does that come from? Where do you think that comes from?
I think it's a thing that runs in my family from both sides. So my dad, he spent a lot of time in America when he was younger. My grandfather, actually from my mother's side, is from Indonesia. He was literally born in the jungle, growing up there with literally nothing. Like his brother had a tiger that he found in the jungle, like that sort of stuff. So yeah, it runs in the family from both sides.
So it's in the blood.
Yeah, definitely.
So have animals always been part of that sort of adventurous side to you? Have you always found yourself drawn towards animals?
Yes, for as long as I can remember, I have loved all animals, because it's a common misconception that people have about me that I'm just into reptiles. That's definitely not true. Ever since I was a little girl, I've loved every single animal I can recall. Like I loved snails, I loved birds. Actually, for a long time, I had my own rabbit farm. So I would breed these very expensive rabbits. And this was like before the internet started. So usually when I would email people to make appointments for these rabbits, they think, oh, like this, like a businesswoman coming, and it was like a 12-year-old kid, like trading all these rabbits. So yeah, I was crazy about rabbits, crazy about horses, grew up in, around farms, because I'm from the farmers part of the Netherlands. So I always help my friends milking the cows and that sort of stuff. So yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a lot of people who are obsessed with animals, you can say, don't really know how it started. Just like you just, as a child, were already obsessed with animals. Like, I'm sure you don't know if anything sparked it, right? It was just sort of always there.
No, I think actually I was born with that. That also runs kind of in a family. Like my mom, I wouldn't say she hates animals, but she definitely dislikes most animals. So that's like was hard for me as a kid, because I always used to bring back like injured birds, injured mice. Actually, I would set up this thing in the shed where she wouldn't come, where I could take care of like cats, dogs, everything. So I was born with that love for animals, but it was fed by my grandmother and by my father, actually. So they were the people who took me into the forest. I live on the edge of a forest. And they always took me there to teach me about the seasons, about what animals live there, about everything that was going on there. So that is also like a family thing, but I think also something that I was just born with, because my sister is not like this at all. She's scared of everything.
Yeah, I definitely have similar experiences. I grew up on a farm as well. So you end up finding birds that fell out of the nest, or mice. Like we had a pool, so we had mice that would fall into the pool, and then all of a sudden you're setting up like little tanks for them and trying to rehabilitate them.
That's awesome. Yeah, I can relate.
So obviously Netherlands is not known for their reptile population. So something drew you towards reptiles as well. So what was that?
Yeah, so like I said, I was always busy taking care of injured animals, and I would always teach people, even though I was super young, I would teach them on how to treat our native wildlife. And then as I became a little bit older, I started noticing that people had these weird preferences. Like we would put the pigs in these horrible, well, I think horrible cages, but then we would love our dogs. Like Dutch people, they basically adore their dogs. They are above the people. And to me it was kind of weird, because I knew I had learned like pigs have the same, if not more, a higher intelligence level than dogs. So what's up with that? And I saw the same thing actually with reptiles. People were kind of like repulsed by them, and I never in my life saw a difference between a dog and a snake. Of course I see they're different animals, but for me that love is just as intense, you know, for both species. So I was kind of really annoyed by that. And around that time, I also started watching Steve Irwin's documentaries with my dad. And I just loved his passion and enthusiasm, and how he dedicated literally every single aspect of his life to wildlife conservation. So basically, what happened one day, I came home from school. This is a little bit corny, but I'll tell you. I came home from school, and my dad said, I think you need to sit down. And he told me that Steve had died. Now, I was just like a 12-year-old kid, and he was my ultimate hero. I loved everything that he did. And so I cried for 3 days. But also on that day, I kind of made a promise to him and to myself that I would dedicate my life to wildlife conservation, in, you know, using my talents, because obviously I'm not Steve, so I'll do it my way. And ever since then, I've dedicated every single school project on reptiles. Yeah, and also throughout in my university work, whenever we got the freedom to pick our own topic, I would just do it on reptiles. So that's basically how that came about.
Well, I really don't think that's corny at all. Actually, that's really cool, and it's interesting that. So were you already for sure going to go into animal science as a focus for university, or did that really, was that a catalyst for you just to decide animals are going to be my career?
No, I knew years before that, you know, animals would be my life. I knew that, but I think what Steve did is he really fueled that passion, and he gave me some direction as to where to go, because I was still like contemplating maybe becoming a vet or working at a zoo. And then, you know, because of him, I knew that I wanted to do actual conservation work.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I talk to a lot of people, obviously with the podcast, people who are in the reptile or the animal, you know, obsession, I can call it. Steve Irwin's name comes up all the time, people. And I actually haven't watched a ton, because when I was younger, we didn't really have TV or didn't have cable, so I never got to see it. I have seen it, but I have not watched it. It wasn't part of my childhood as much as I talked to some of my guests, and it is amazing how much influence he had on the world, really.
Yeah, it's so cool. And even though like a lot of things, now that I'm working with venomous snakes myself, I do completely different. And his handling techniques to me are sometimes bizarre. Like I wouldn't do that, but I still respect him so much as a person, you know. And that's also a reason for me to want to be an example for people, because I know that works. For instance, I do these educational shows in the Netherlands for small children, and they already know so much about reptiles. And that's basically because of this Dutch dude. He's called Freek Vonk. He's like the Dutch Steve Irwin. And they all are interested in biology and in reptiles because of someone they look up to. Mm-hmm. So I think that's just a great concept.
Yeah. And I mean, when you wake up in the morning and you have such a deep purpose, it feels good, right? You can go after it, and it feels like you're accomplishing something.
Definitely. For me, the scariest thing in life, luckily I've never had that, but when I meet people who tell me that they just don't know what they like or what they're into, and they don't know where life is going to take them, it's unbelievable to me, because ever since I can remember, I knew what my mission on this planet was, you know. Mm-hmm. And I never had to think twice about any decision in my life. And I just know that, everything I do is for wildlife conservation, and it makes my life so easy and so nice. As you say, it's great to wake up and know your purpose.
Yeah, no, and actually I can relate to it because I was an athlete for my whole life, and then I retired from being an athlete, and I had probably about a year where I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and it was really horrible, and it actually made me sick. Like I didn't even, like, it made me nauseous almost, and I didn't even it was just pure anxiety. And so looking for a passion is something that you have is super important, and then it's just makes your life more enjoyable, obviously, and what you're doing is great work. So I think one of the really interesting things on your about page, and we kind of had talked about this already, was it seems like your mission really is to sort of redefine how people see reptiles. And I think one of the examples that you use is, the pandas have always been the poster child of conservation, and what you're trying to do is shift it a little bit to include more animals like reptiles, especially because a lot of people don't understand the role they play in ecology. So can you chat a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. So lots of people often ask me, like, why does it matter if I like reptiles or not? Because, everybody likes something. So, why is that important? And it's not because of me. I personally don't care what you like, but it's just a simple fact that the public opinion on an animal can seal its fate. So with the panda, people love it. It looks cuddly. And that's the reason why if you apply for, well, not anymore because they're kind of like not endangered anymore, but back in those years, if you would apply for a research grant about panda conservation, the money would rain from the skies. And that's because everybody loves the panda, So the reason why I want to change the public opinion on reptiles in general is because it will directly have an effect on their persistence on this earth. Right now, there are species dying out that nobody has ever even heard of. And to me, that's just so saddening. So there is a real thinking behind why I want to improve the public opinion on reptiles, because I think that it will generate money for research, because there's lots of fundamental knowledge that's lacking now that we do have on many mammal species, but as well as on conservation plans that are currently lacking or just really poorly designed and not working. So that's the reason why I want to change the public opinion. And like you said, there's many things that people don't know about reptiles. That's about their biology and about like how cool they are, how fast they are, how a gecko can walk upside down, how a chameleon can change its colors. That's amazing. But it's also really their function in the ecosystem. That's the reason why I became an ecologist. I'm really interested in if you have this house of cards and you pick one card out, the whole thing is going to come down. So if we don't take care of every part of the chain, that's going to affect us in the end. So for instance, if we look at crocodiles, they actually prevent diseases. They eat the carcasses so that the diseases don't spread into the river system and kill the fish and therefore the birds, etc. Or another very cool study on Nile crocodiles, for instance, they found out that if you take them out of the ecosystem, these very large predatory catfish, their populations will explode, therefore reducing or eliminating other species of fish, which is better on its own, but also it will reduce the amount of birds that come to that area. So yeah, that's stuff that I'm really interested in and stuff that I want to let people know.
Yeah.
It's not just because they're cool, they're really helpful to our ecosystems, essential.
It is really interesting when you do break it down. It is a very delicate system that has, every species does play a part, and that prey-predator relationship is obviously super important. And people tend to be, this is the experience that I have with reptiles. I have reptiles. People think I'm just automatically a strange weirdo because I have them, especially in Canada. It's not super popular. But when people come here, they're typically scared. And as soon as I pull out a snake and they look at it, they let it crawl on the floor, and then they eventually touch it, and then eventually they hold it, and they typically will leave thinking, wow, that was nothing like I thought it was going to be. And I've had people get into snakes or want to get into the hobby just because they come here and they were scared beforehand. So it is about exposing people to these animals.
Yeah, it's cool that you mention it, actually, because some of the critique that I sometimes get is, but why do you need to bring these animals to the stage? And the reason is really what you're saying right now. If I just put a photo up, it will never make the same impression, lasting impression on a person than when they get to see this animal up close, even touch it sometimes. So yeah, that does really make a big change.
Yeah, no, definitely. And one of the things that I do with the podcast and the YouTube channel is I support a charity that helps conserve the Amazon rainforest. So it's a Canadian charity, and then I take some of the profits and I donate it to them. And for me, it was really important. I have very tight ethical bounds when it comes to keeping animals. Like I am very much against wild caught and making sure everything is captive bred in the hobby and whatnot. But it's exactly to your point, and that was my point to the charity, was that I wouldn't be interested in donating to a conservation charity if I didn't own these animals or wasn't able to interact with them. Not that because I'm an evil person and I hate the rainforest, it just wouldn't have crossed my mind, right? It wouldn't have crossed my mind that, wow, this Brazilian rainbow boa that's right behind me, there are a bunch of them in the wild that need protection.
Yep, that's so true.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the research that you've done in the past. I know that you spent a lot of time in South Africa.
Yeah, I did a couple of studies. The study in South Africa was for my master's thesis. And basically that relates back to what I just mentioned, the lack of fundamental knowledge that we have on reptiles. So I think there's a couple of things important in reptile conservation. That's to increase the awareness, which is what I do with my social media and stuff, to increase the fundamental knowledge, and also work on creating optimal conservation strategies. So my goal in South Africa was to find out what habitat characteristics are important for reptiles. And that's very basic knowledge. We know that of many mammals what's important, but not so much about many reptile species. And as well, I wanted to compare two different assessment methods, because that's a thing that herpetologists often struggle with, is just knowing what lives here and in what amounts, because most reptiles, they live a very secretive life. So about the habitat characteristics that were important for the abundance and diversity of the species there, I basically found not enough reptiles to do a proper analysis on that. I could only do an analysis if I lumped all the species together, which made me find out that actually you need to look per species, because reptiles are so different. The species are so different in their preferences. Like some are active during the night, some are really bound to rocks, for instance. So that's actually proving my point that it is so hard to find, to assess how many reptiles there are. And I try to find them by doing active surveys. So these are timed surveys. And just basically what you do is you walk around and you note down every reptile that you see. You note down the species, what time of the day it is, what it was doing, etc. And then I also had these setups with drift fences and funnel traps at different habitat types as well. And what I found out is that these different methods completely target different species. Like there's almost no overlap between those two different assessment methods. And that's actually kind of important, because that means that if you want to get a complete insight in what lives in a habitat type, you would need to combine different methods actually to get a proper insight into that. So that was what I was doing in South Africa, as well as talking a lot to local people. That was initially not even why I got there. I thought I would be really isolated and not really get a chance to talk to people. But it was so incredibly valuable to me, because I found out that I talk a lot. So I love to tell people about reptiles and about how cool they are. But it's so incredibly important to sometimes just sit down and listen. Because I would get in like pythons that were almost stoned to death because they ate a goat, and I would get so angry and so frustrated. And I just wanted to tell them, like, don't do that, because before that rock python got to that size, it eats rodents, which is good for your crop fields, right? You don't have to use pesticides to get rid of these rodents. So why would you do that? And instead of that, I just sat down and listened, like, why actually did you kill this python? And then I found out that there's so much, like superstition and native beliefs that play an incredible role. So they, for instance, believe that the fat of a python can cure some types of cancer, can help you with arthritis and some other things. So there are often a lot of deeper issues in, the conflict between reptiles and people. And that was a very important lesson that I learned in South Africa and later on my other trips as well. But that was not even why I went there, but it was something that was so crucial for my own understanding of the relationship between people and reptiles.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, reptiles do have a lot of myths that sort of, in a lot of different countries, myths are very different, but that is really interesting. So as a rule, do they really see reptiles as mostly a pest, and they actually have a lot of myths that support reasons to kill them and consume them?
Not just as a pest. Sometimes, for instance, with the chameleons, whenever these native people will see a chameleon, they will literally turn around and go back to where they came from, because they think it is, a sign of bad luck, or there's so many things. Not necessarily that they view them as a pest. They sometimes just think that they will bring evil, and in some cases they will bring luck as well. So yeah, there's lots of different things. One story that I can really remember that impacted me so much, if you don't mind me telling.
Absolutely.
It's I was in Ivory Coast, and I was working with a PhD student, a very bright, intelligent person, and we were discussing some of the work that we were doing on crocodiles. And I mentioned to him that I really love snakes. So then he says, well, I got bitten one time by a snake. And I said, oh, because there's some really venomous species there, like how did that go? And he said, well, I went to my local doctor, and he gave me this black stone that I needed to put on the bite side. I said, why? And he said, as long as the stone is on the bite side, stays on there, there is venom in my system. And if it falls off, it's out. So he went to sleep with the black stone on his arm, and the next morning it had obviously fallen off. So he was healthy in his mind, like he was cured from the snake bites. And I just was at loss for words, because this was clearly a very intelligent person. He was not stupid, but it didn't occur to him that, well, maybe that snake wasn't even venomous, it was just mind-boggling to me that was so ingrained into his culture, and that actually has very negative effects for people worldwide, because they will rather seek out these natural healers instead of going to the hospital, which is something that you need to do if you get bitten by a snake.
Yeah, no kidding. So he was actually under the impression that he was envenomated, and the black stone actually helped him.
Yes, for real. Yes.
So I actually had a conversation with Kristen Wiley, who works at the Kentucky Reptile Zoo. I don't know if you're familiar with that zoo. They have a very large reptile or a venomous collection, and she had said in India that's obviously a big issue as well. People get bit by snakes all the time, and the way she explained it was really interesting. She said that when these people are bit by snakes, typically the hospitals are so far away that if they do go to a hospital, they end up dying anyway. So these cultures sort of see the hospital as they don't work. Like there's no point in going to the hospital. So they do go to the witch doctor or the shaman, and probably maybe half the time the shaman works, because it could have been a dry bite or it could have been a non-venomous snake. And so it just reinforces exactly what you're saying. Like you have a PhD student who thinks that putting a black rock on his arm is going to cure him of a snake envenomation. It's really incredible, actually. And partly if we lived in those cultures, we would most likely believe the same thing.
Oh, definitely. Yes. We think we are all so enlightened and that we would never do that, but it's not the case. It's just a really hard cycle to break, I think.
Definitely, yeah. And snakes do have that sort of, because they can be so deadly, and they're so peculiar creatures, like they have no legs, and that's where they have all this myth behind them, that all these extra stories get layered on top. Like not other animals don't have, like if you get bit by a bear, you know that it's serious, but it's very strange in that sense. So in South Africa, when you're setting up these traps, what kind of animals were you collecting?
I was getting a lot of invertebrates, which was pretty cool, and it helped me to overcome the fear of some of them, because I'd rather deal with like 3 black mambas than with the crickets that they have there. They're huge, they're insanely big. Yeah, I would catch, that was actually pretty cool. I caught multiple fossorial snakes. So they would come up at night or after the rain and end up in my traps. Many species of lizards, some other species of snakes, even a boomslang. So that was kind of cool because they usually live up in the trees. Yeah, lots of animals actually.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Obviously, they have a pretty rich diversity of reptiles there.
Yes, yes. There's so many cool species there, and I learned so much about the species that live there. And one time I remember I caught a centipede, and I also caught a snake that was a centipede eater. So I was like, okay, I want to see you eat this centipede. He didn't catch it, unfortunately, but it was cool to watch. I watched the snake for like, I don't know, 4 hours or something. Put it in a bucket with some soil and just
like, come on, eat the centipede.
yeah, that would have been so cool to watch.
Oh, that's awesome. And then the Ivory Coast, I think that was mostly crocodile work that you were doing.
That's true. So through the Future for Nature award, I got in touch with Matt Shirley, who is my supervisor for that project. And we got to know each other, and he said, well, if you want, you can come and do an internship here, because I still needed that for my master's. And I said, I'd rather do a thesis, like a proper, study. And then basically I decided to study crocodiles and climate change, because I saw some studies of predictive studies that it could have an effect on several animal species, but there was nothing on crocodiles. And I thought it was quite interesting because these animals are cold-blooded. So obviously changes in the environment, can potentially greatly affect them. So that's why I decided to go there and collect some data. But most of the data I actually collected sitting behind my desk. And it was an immense task, because I had to dive into all these different types of literature, from musea to scientific published data to fieldworker databases, as well as grey literature, but also YouTube videos, people's holiday photographs, like everything. Because I wanted to build this massive data set on West African crocodilians. Like everything that anybody ever saw, I wanted in there. And then I tried to georeference them. So some of these sightings would be very precise, and we would know, okay, the croc was definitely there. And some of these sightings were like, I don't even know if you saw a croc for sure. So that's how that works. And then basically I did some really complicated mathematics to find out how it could potentially, change their distribution.
And did you find that the climate change was changing the distribution?
Yes, actually, my results there were quite interesting. With the variables that I used, I found out that the amount of suitable habitat actually drastically increases with climate change. I used different climate scenarios. So one where we go on the way that we are doing now, like nothing changes. One where we go full on Trump and everything gets way worse. And one where we are like, okay, we need to change things and we all get solar power and whatever. But under all these three scenarios, the amount of suitable habitat did increase, which was kind of really interesting. That doesn't mean that the future is bright for these crocodiles at all, because there's a couple of endangered species there, like Osteolaemus is not doing well, as well as, of course, the slender-snouted crocodile, which is really endangered. So that's why we want to continue the work on that, because the variables that I used were mainly temperature related and rainfall related. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we incorporate like intensity of the storms, for instance, which could be really critical, because most of the crocodiles, they build their nests on the river bank. And if the storms increase, their eggs could flush away, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's also the huge issue there of land conversion. Like before 2040, the human population in entire Africa will double. That's insane. All these people will need to live somewhere, work somewhere. All these people will need to eat. So what I saw in West Africa myself is that most of the rainforest is just converted to banana plantations, cacao, rubber, palm oil. There's so little prime habitat left. So that's something that I want to incorporate in my further analysis as well. And there's also poaching going on for some species, which is pretty severe. And then there's also fishery. So because the human population is exploding there, people are starting to fish more. So the lakes and the rivers, they get more and more empty, as well as these crocodiles. They quite often get stuck in the nets, so they will drown. So yeah, there's a couple of things that I also want to incorporate in the future study.
So were you also catching some live specimens and tagging them, or?
Yes, we because I also was involved in another study there. What we did is we checked the blood of the crocodiles. So a couple of years before me, people from the Albuquerque Biopark, they went to Ivory Coast and they sampled the blood of the crocodiles in the zoo in Abidjan, which is a whole story of itself. It's insane. Like it was really sad for me to visit that zoo. But they found out a couple of years ago that all the crocodiles, without exception, were calcium deficient.
At the zoo?
So that was, yeah, that
Gotcha.
was a really big problem. Like they were like borderline dying.
So is that why you're saying it was so sad? Like the conditions of the animals were not good?
Yes, like for instance, when I got there a couple of days before, the visitors had stoned a baby crocodile to death. Like chimpanzees, basically bathing in plastic bottles. The vet told me, like she was a British girl, really cool girl. She told me that she had to explain to the keepers that chimpanzees drink water. So yeah, they didn't have water. They were literally, dying of thirst. But they said like they're fine, they're alive, and that's only because they sometimes got like an orange or something that got a little bit of moisture. And just it was just such a sad situation with very sick animals. The cages were like horrible. When I was there, they lost a crocodile because one of the cages was so badly damaged because of a hurricane or something, like 2 years ago. Nobody, got to fix that. So it just ran off. And after 2 weeks, there still was no sign of a crocodile. And then I got a phone call and they said like a toddler was in the backside of the zoo peeing, like just not on a toilet, whatever. And he was peeing on that croc.
Oh my God.
So they found it back, but they thought it had gone off into the city, which also happened with a chimpanzee, was just off running in the ghetto, and like it was crazy.
Wow.
So anyway, the colleagues from the Albuquerque Biopark, back in the day, they asked them like, what do you feed these crocodiles? And they said either nothing or like chicken from the supermarket, like these fillets. And by the way, what I want to mention is this is not the fault of the zookeepers, because they don't even get paid. So if you don't have money to feed your children, then obviously you're not going to bother about zoo animals. That's just how humans are, and I don't blame them at all. They're amazing people. This is just...
It's a bigger problem than that.
Yeah, it's a sad reality of Africa. They're not to blame at all. They are wonderful people. So yeah, they basically explain like there's no money to buy food for the crocodiles or the other animals. So usually we don't feed them, or sometimes people give us like these chicken fillets from the supermarket. Obviously, that's a big problem for crocodiles because they need bone, they need organ, they need hair, they need a complete animal. They're true carnivores. So with the help of the Albuquerque Zoo, they changed the diet completely. This was also funded by a private person who really likes crocodiles, which I think is insane. Like he paid for the food of the crocodiles for years out of his own pocket.
Wow.
Yeah, he's amazing. And so when I was there, I helped to take the blood of these crocodiles to check it again. I ran the analysis, and they are now perfectly healthy blood level wise. So that was amazing to see. And then also, because you talked about catching crocodiles in the wild, we really wanted to compare that blood to the wild crocodiles to see if it was like similar. And yeah, that was really cool. So my first croc, I remember it so well, was in the middle of the night, was a pitch black night in the jungles of the Thai National Park. And I went on this little tiny rubber boat with Matt, my supervisor, and he asked me if I wanted to catch one. I said, of course, like it's my biggest dream to catch a wild crocodile. So we were shining our lights on the water surface to see the ice. They light up in red. And yeah, I spotted this tiny little crocodile on the riverbank. And it was kind of hard to get to because it was like a steep riverbank with lots of vegetation, but I just wanted to catch that crocodile. So, and he didn't, I don't know why, but he didn't really explain how to do it. So I just went to the front of the boat and he said, "You need to get down." I'm like, "Do I need to get down? Okay." And then when we got close, I just jumped into the black water. I couldn't see anything because it was so dark. And I got out of the water and I got the croc in my hand. So that was pretty awesome. And yeah, I cried.
That sounds terrifying.
It was amazing.
Jumping into black water in the middle of the night when you're specifically looking for crocodiles sounds like something very small percentage of the population would actually do.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there were some big ones around as well, but yeah, I loved every minute of it. It was so cool.
So what was it like when you grab him? Is it, I mean, obviously he wasn't huge. It was a smaller animal, but was it thrashing? Like, was it hard to hold on to?
No, I mean, crocodiles, they are quite strong, but I've also found that once they relax, they are quite okay, actually. So if you don't do anything too crazy, they calm down quite quickly. We cut off a part of the, it sounds terrible, but it's not. You can mark them by cutting off a scale of the tail,
yeah,
just to have a numeric system. And that's what we did. And we took the blood sample and he was all fine. We also recorded his vocalizations because there was another girl with me in Ivory Coast who studies croc talk, basically, because they are probably much more social and vocal than we ever realized. And there's like, populations that really interact with each other. So we also recorded the noises that it made. So yeah, no, it was actually quite a chill crocodile. I've had definitely worse experiences with some of the snakes that I've caught.
Yeah, the vocalization of crocodiles is really interesting. It's such a deep guttural sound. It almost seems like that sound shouldn't be coming from that animal, considering a lot of reptiles don't make noise.
Exactly. It's so surreal to hear that. Even like with alligators, when they start bellowing, I'm always like, wow, that's just so cool.
Mm-hmm. So when you take blood from something like a crocodile, how do you, do you have a special needle or something, or is there just a specific spot that you can get into the soft tissue?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked because it's actually quite interesting, and I was quite nervous to do that. Obviously, for my studies, I had taken so many blood samples, but never from a crocodile. And usually with reptiles, we try to do the tail. But crocodiles, they have a very complex blood flow. And they can actually decide, well, it's not really decide, but they can allocate where they send blood to. So as soon as you start fiddling around with that tail, they will restrict the blood flow, and then it will become a hassle for both of us. Like, it's not nice for the crocodile, it's quite stressful. And for us, we usually don't get a good blood sample. So what we do is we pick a vein in the neck. So you basically go straight behind the head, because the brains will always need like oxygen-rich blood. So there you will always get a good blood sample, but it's quite scary because there's some nerves running there as well. So you need to be quite careful. But I picked it up quite quickly, and yeah, we take a blood sample from the neck, and it always works.
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess it makes sense that the blood would shunt away from the extremities when they're in a little bit of a stressful environment. That's cool. Yeah. So let's talk about some venomous snakes. Of course, you don't start with, you don't get into venomous as your first reptile. So how did that happen? Where did you go from, your regular reptiles to working with venomous?
So when I was 18, I already told my parents when Steve died, like, when I turn 18, I'll go to Australia, like, bye. Because I want to see for myself if it's really as cool as I dream about every night. So when I was 18, I went straight to Australia, but I wasn't part of any like herb community whatsoever. I was just on my own, like traveling the country, not only for reptiles, also just for my own personal development. And I wish I had gone to like take a course or something, but it was quite a while ago. So we were not as connected as we are today. At least I wasn't, for sure. I didn't even have like a smartphone or anything. I had like this Nokia phone where you can play like the original Snake. Like, that was me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm always like maybe 5 years behind on the normal people. So I went there and I caught some cool snakes. Luckily, nothing too venomous. Until one day I was walking on this jungle trail, and my friend was walking in front of me, and she screamed so loudly, and she jumped and she held onto me like with her legs and her arms, and I could see like this coastal taipan slipping away from, like, behind her. I was like, no way, it's a coastal taipan. So I tried to get it, and and it was a struggle. And in the end, like, I didn't grab it. I'm so glad I didn't.
Oh my God, you're stressing me out.
Yeah, exactly. So I just thought I would like go full Steve Irwin on that snake, and I'm so glad I didn't. So that was a good lesson. And then when I got back from Australia, pretty much the first thing that I did was I went to this forum and said, hey, I'm this 18-year-old girl, and I really, really want to learn how to handle venomous snakes. It's my biggest passion in life. Who can help me? Nobody replied for a long time. And then there was this one guy who was willing to see if it was a dodgy thing or not. And I met up with him, and it was so great. He was such a respectful, intelligent person who taught me the first steps. And then basically the word kind of spread that I was like a legit person, and I was actually serious about this. And that's what you need in the Dutch venomous snake community. Like, you need people to put in a word for you, and to they want to teach serious people, and I totally get that. That's what we need. And then I basically traveled the country for, I think, 1 year, going to every corner of the country every weekend. So I would go to people who just keep vipers, and then other people just keep leopards, because I wanted to learn as much as I could. And after that, I met Romilly, and he had King Cobra, so that's where I stayed. Romilly Vandenberg, he's quite a well-known leopard breeder, and from the second I met his King Cobras, I just knew that that was the person to be with, and he taught me most of what I know from venomous snake handling.
Did you have reptiles as pets before you went to Australia?
Not before I went to Australia, because I come from a really religious part of the country, probably the most religious town of the entire country. And my parents never wanted me to keep anything, because they, think it's Satan or whatever, I don't know. So I was never allowed to keep anything. So when I got back from Australia, I went straight to uni, and I got my own place. And the first thing I did was I bought a boa constrictor and went on to learn how to handle venomous snakes.
So that is the venomous snake thing is so interesting, because you handle some serious venomous snakes. Obviously, we were talking about the King Cobra, and I've seen like black mamba and whatnot. Why? Like, what do you think gravitated you towards that?
I love all snakes. Like I said, I love all animals. I love all snakes. But the thing with the venomous snakes, and especially the elapids, is that they are so incredibly interesting to me. So many of the elapids are active hunters, which is something that I find very, very cool. So they're not like ambush predators like some of your pythons and rattlers and whatnot. So I've always found it very interesting, their hunting techniques, the fact that they are so agile and fast and like always alert. That's something that just was very cool to me. And then with the King Cobras, of course, I saw them on television and everything. I thought they were cool snakes. But when I saw one for the first time, it was just like, I literally fell in love. I cannot describe it any other way. Like, I saw that snake and I just was, I couldn't say a word because of how cool they were. It was just something that got into my head, into my heart, and I was hooked.
Yeah, well, elapids are really interesting because of the way they move. They do move so differently than most snakes, and that's what I mean. They really look sketchy to me when you're handling them, just because of how quickly they move and how inquisitive they look. They really do look like they're analyzing a situation when they're in front of you. And I actually had no interest in venom until a few years ago when I started looking into it. And I mean, for me, how venom evolved and the way it's diverged across all these different families and whatnot, I find incredibly interesting. So it's a very bizarre concept that there's animals on the planet that can bite you and inject you with something that can kill you, and working with them is like a whole other level. Have you had any close calls?
Have I had any close calls? Not really. I mean, sometimes Rumley's place, the space is really small and kings are really big. Mm-hmm. So you need to jump fast, and that sometimes it gets kind of close. But I've never had a situation where I thought, okay, I'd be dead now. One thing I did have in South Africa is I was bitten by a snake that is only supposed to be like mildly venomous and harmless to humans. And I couldn't feel my arm. I couldn't move my fingers. I was like completely, you know, paralyzed on that limb. And that's because I have quite a severe venom allergy from working with spitting cobras all the time for years now. So that's the only thing that's tricky for me. So I know that if I get bitten by, you know, something serious like a king or a mamba, that is probably the end of the story. I mean, I have an EpiPen, but I weigh like 53 kilos. So
yeah. And they inject a lot of venom. And that's a weird thing about working with elapids. It's like everybody, you have like a year of working with elapids until you become like anaphylactic, allergic to just the venom itself. It's like a double whammy.
Yes, that's so true.
So do you find yourself like sneezing and getting like stuffed up when you're working in a room full of kings, or?
Not necessarily kings. There are some species of cobras that I really react to quite heavily. I can remember one time I was in a car and I was just having this extreme allergic reaction. Like my eyes were closed. I couldn't stop sneezing. I was like, what is this? I'm not in a room with a snake. And then there was this bucket that the guy that owned the car, he used to keep these spitting cobras in there, Mozambique spitting cobras in there. And because of the traces of that venom, I got that heavy like allergic reaction. So there's some species of cobra that I really react quite strongly to, But it's also my own fault. Like there's things you can do to prevent it. Like for instance, not sleep in a bedroom with 20 spitters, wear like a face mask instead of just glasses, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, because I mean, once the venom dries, it just gets into the air, right? And then eventually you're just going to develop like an antibody to it. And so you've also you teach people how to handle snakes properly. Now at this point, you've done enough where you're actually having lectures. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I give all sorts of lectures, from like primary school to university to people who are, how do you call this, like zookeeper students, that kind of stuff, everything in between. And then sometimes we do these courses for people who want to learn how to handle venomous snakes. So I organized one with Brian Fry, you know him, obviously.
Yeah.
And basically what we did is we took a very broad selection of snakes. So from your vipers to your elapids, we had some rattlers, I think, like a lot of different snake species, and people learn everything. It's a very like full-on course, but we learn them how to hook, how to use tongs, how to tube, how to, you know, administer medication, first aid, of course. So yeah, I really, really love doing that.
That's really cool. And is there a one mistake that people make all the time when they're handling venomous snakes? I don't want people to think that they can listen to this and then go off and handle venomous snakes, but is there one mistake that people commonly make when they first approach a venomous animal compared to something that isn't?
I see a lot of mistakes.
Too many to choose from.
Yeah, so where it usually goes wrong is people see a lot of necking. Like on social media, we see people grab a snake behind the head. That's called necking. And that is actually a very advanced handling move. Like that is something that you can only do if you had a mentor teach you that. You start with non-venomous snakes on how to, you know, get the proper grip. There's snakes that can bite through their own bottom jaw. So they can pierce your skin easily, even if you think like, okay, I'm far away from the teeth. You're probably not that far away from the teeth. And we see these photos shared widely from people, you know, grabbing snakes behind the neck. And that's one of the most dangerous things you can do, even as an experienced snake keeper. We don't like doing that. We only do it when it's highly, highly necessary. And people just think, oh, it's a venomous snake, I should grab it behind the head. No. Don't do that, please. So that's something that I see quite often, and it really annoys me quite a lot.
Yeah, well, One of the cool things about handling venomous snakes is when I was talking to Kristen about it, it really seems like you have to be in this very specific mindset, and it's almost like a meditative experience almost, just because you really cannot let your mind get distracted from, like, you know, bad things that happen that day, or, you know, your to-do list, or what you're going to eat for dinner, all those little things that clutter our brains. Do you really feel like that you can relate to that you really have to clear the mind and perform?
Yes, totally. I can totally relate to that. And I feel that there were periods in my life where I let stuff get into my mind, and then something will happen that wakes me up. So, for instance, not too long ago, somebody who's, I think, even younger than myself died when extracting black mamba venom. And these things really, you know, of course, they hit home, and they make me realize what I do is actually so dangerous. So I totally get what she says. It's something that requires like 110% of your attention, and you can never think, okay, I've done this 100 times, so it will be fine, because that's when you will start to make mistakes.
Yeah, that's one of the things I had asked her about as well, was there's always that fear of becoming complacent, because you do handle them all the time. You're like, this is the same thing over and over, but really every snake is like your first snake.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And snakes also have personalities. So just because you handle 10 very mild-mannered black mambas doesn't mean that the 11th black mamba is going to be like that at all. So...
Well, it definitely takes a specific type of person to be able to do that. It's something that I know I would never be able to do. So watching people like yourself is really cool. It's a really interesting thing. And I know that you've caught like wild king cobras as well in Bali and whatnot.
Yes, that's true.
What's that like? What is an experience like catching a wild one?
So, like I said, I fell in love with that species. It's, you know, so close to my heart. And then I got the opportunity to join a team to make a documentary. And we were debating on what to allocate the money to. And I said, I want to do the king cobra, just because it's such a unique snake in many, many ways. So it's highly, highly venomous. The people in Southeast Asia are usually aware that it's a snake eater. So you can't tell them, well, it eats rodents, so it helps you know. Like, for them, they know it eats snakes, so they don't really make the connection that it's an apex predator and that it, you know, regulates the whole ecosystem. So they usually get killed on sight. And then also the nests are set on fire by the local population. So the king cobras, they are declining. And they really have a bad reputation. So that's why I said we need to do the king cobra, and, you know, that's my passion. So we went there, and I met up with Shinta, who is the owner of the Bali Reptile Rescue Center. And already meeting her was so insane, because she's a woman and she's running this entire center, and she's like such a badass person. And she also loves king cobra. So that was an insane connection that I never had with anyone else. And then we went into the forest, and we got a call that there was a king cobra on some farmland, and it needed to be relocated. And Shinta said, well, you can do it. And I really loved how she put like all the trust in me. So I saw the mother sitting on a nest, and I hooked it, and I hooked it towards me so I could grab it, and then I necked it. And the moment I had it in my hands, I just started crying. I couldn't stop crying. And the cameraman asked me, like, what do you feel? How do you feel? And it's like hard to explain, but it's like everything in my life that I ever dreamed about came together in that moment. Like, it was such a big moment of fulfillment that is just undescribable. I just couldn't put it into words how that made me feel, because I knew we were doing something great. We were saving her life and the life of her babies. And to be that close to something that can kill you so easily, like you said, it's actually such an amazing weapon that, you know, evolved. It's such a humbling experience. I mean, it's maybe it sounds a bit stupid, but to me, it was just the best thing that I ever experienced. No,
I don't think it's stupid at all, and I think it really ties in that, you know, your trip as an 18-year-old and or even Steve Irwin's death, right? It sort of finished off the story, but really it's the start of the story. But it brought you to that moment where you're actually in front of a camera doing exactly what Steve was doing, that inspired you to do it in the first place.
Yeah, that's so true. That's exactly what it was.
So I think that documentary was with the Conservation Front, or is that right? Can you, I don't know. I don't really know much about that. Is that something that's going to be available for people to see at some point in the near future, or?
Definitely. So the idea was just like, we were just a bunch of people who loved nature and all had our own skills. So there was like an editor, someone who was a cameraman for the BBC, Jason Savage, who's a wildlife photographer. And we just said, okay, we got this money from this private donator. Let's build a team and let's just do the first episodes on king cobras and see how that goes. So that's in the editing process now. We will show it to some channels, but it's definitely our intention to put it online for everybody to see. But obviously we want to generate more money for future episodes on rhinos, on the eagles in the Philippines. We have so many plans. So there's definitely a lot more coming from us, and we will make sure that everybody can see the content.
So if people want to just kind of stay in touch with that, if they follow at Conservation Front on Instagram, that'll keep them up to date?
Yes, for sure. Like all the big developments we will put on there, and definitely when it comes online, you will be able to see it on there, but also through all our personal channels as well.
Sure. And one last thing I wanted to talk to you about. I know you're big on education, and you'd mentioned to me that you're working on a children's book.
Yes, that's true. It's such a cool thing. I'm so happy about that. I recently signed a contract with the management in Amsterdam, and they asked me like, what kind of things do you want in life and from your career? And one of the things was writing a book. And I think it is so important to start with the younger generation, because they are usually the people who really listen. Like whenever I'm in an audience, they are the ones who ask the questions, and they're the ones who are truly curious, and their perception is not fully formed yet. So that's why I knew it had to be a children's book. And it's basically about reptiles, about how they came to be on this planet, all their cool features. There's a chapter on reptile superheroes. So some of them, they have venom that saves lives. Like I said, some of them can change color. Some of them can swim thousands of kilometers. And then there's also a chapter on the Dutch reptiles, because I want them to go out and look for reptiles and, get inspired. So yeah, hopefully that will be out in June. And I really hope we will sell the translation rights as well, so we can also publish it in English.
Yeah, that's a great project. And you're totally right. When the kids are young, they all like reptiles. They think it's cool. Like even the ones that are a little bit scared, they're curious and they have questions. And it usually it's the adults that are like, oh, let's get rid of these things.
That's so true. Yes. And I even once overheard a conversation that in my audience, there was this dad that said, I don't understand what she's talking about me, because sometimes I get too scientific and my audience is like 5 years old. But the child actually understood it, and he was listening much better than his dad. And he's like, but Dad, I understand it. She said this and this and this. It's not that hard. I get so happy when I hear this, because children, they are truly like the best audience. I love it.
Yeah, that's an incredible thing, and well, I'm really excited for that book. I hope there is a translation so we can read it here in English, and I think maybe in the future we can have you back on if you guys are going to continue to do some conservation front. I would love to continue to follow up on other documentaries as well, because this podcast is not, I didn't call it Reptiles at Home. I called it Animals at Home, because I don't want to just pigeonhole the show to just one type of animal. So I would love to chat more about that. Can you let everybody know where they can find you online?
Yeah, so I have a Facebook page and an Instagram page, which are both called STERRIN'S Wild World. So I'm very easy to find there. I also have a website, STERRIN'sWildWorld.com. And I'm also working on more YouTube content. So definitely also check out my YouTube channel. There will be some cool videos on there soon. So yeah, that's where you can find me. Yeah,
and I'll have everything posted in the show notes so people can find you relatively easy. Thank you so much for coming on. I feel like I could continue talking to you for so long, but I don't want to take up more of your day. That was a really, really interesting stories you have, and definitely I'd love to have you back on.
Thanks so much. I'd love to be back on.
All right, everybody, that is the end of another episode. Thank you so much for listening. I do really appreciate it. Sterrin, if you're listening to this right now, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I hope I can have you back on again so we can follow up and continue that conversation. If you're looking for more information on this episode, make sure you go to animalsathome.ca/podcast and just click on this episode. It's episode number 17, and you'll find all the links to everything you need to know in there. If you are enjoying the show, make sure you please subscribe on iTunes and rate the show on iTunes. That helps me a ton. Subscribe on YouTube. You can follow me on Instagram at animalsathomec. And if you want to buy an Animals at Home t-shirt, you can go to animalsathome.ca/shop, and there you can find the selection of t-shirts that we have. And you know, $5 for every shirt does get donated to the Amazon Rainforest Conservancy. We'll talk to you guys next time.